The conquest commander Zethkar stood on the bridge of the massive dreadnought Void Piercer, watching Earth grow larger in the viewport. The blue-green planet looked so peaceful, so defenseless. His mandibles clicked in what passed for laughter among the Kethmori Empire. Such a primitive world. His second-in-command, Captain Velthos, hissed beside him. Look at all that green. They waste so much land on useless vegetation when they could build proper cities. The Kethmori had conquered 17 star systems in the past decade. Their gray, metallic homeworld had taught them that efficiency meant covering every surface with structures. Vegetation was weakness. Wilderness was chaos that needed control. The intelligence reports say most of their planet is still wild, Zethkar said, studying the tactical display. Forests, jungles, mountains, with no settlements. What kind of species allows such disorder? The fleet of 200 warships hung in space like metal predators. Each ship bristled with plasma cannons and void missiles. The Kethmori military had never lost a campaign. Their strategy was simple: destroy the enemy's cities, break their will, and force surrender within days. Down on Earth, the governments had been watching the alien fleet for 3 days. Panic spread through major cities as people tried to evacuate. The United Earth Defense Force scrambled their fighters and orbital platforms, but everyone knew it wasn't enough. The alien ships were too advanced, too numerous. In the Amazon rainforest, Sergeant Maria Santos crouched behind a fallen log, watching her team set up camouflaged positions. The 5th Special Forces Group had been ordered to prepare for guerrilla warfare if the cities fell. Most people thought it was hopeless, but Maria had grown up in these jungles. She knew what the trees could hide. "You really think we can fight those things with rifles and explosives?" asked Private Chen, nervous sweat beading on his face despite the humid air. "We'll see," Maria replied, checking her equipment. Her team carried weapons that looked primitive compared to alien technology, but they were tools designed by humans who understood Earth's wilderness. Sometimes the jungle chooses who survives. The first alien attack came at dawn. Plasma beams lanced down from orbit, turning New York's skyscrapers into molten metal. London burned under void missiles. Tokyo disappeared in a cloud of superheated steam. The major cities that had taken centuries to build were gone in hours. But the aliens had made their first mistake. They targeted only the obvious population centers, the places that showed up clearly on orbital scans. They ignored the vast green spaces that covered most of the planet. To the Kethmori, those areas were empty wasteland. As the alien dropships descended to claim the ruins, Zethkar felt confident victory was assured. The humans had barely put up a fight. Their primitive ships had been destroyed easily. Soon, Kethmori engineers would begin converting this chaotic world into proper order. The first landing zones were established on the blackened remains of major cities. Thousands of Kethmori soldiers in powered armor marched through the rubble, their scanners sweeping for any remaining resistance. They found scattered groups of survivors hiding in basements and subway tunnels, easily captured or eliminated. "Pathetic," Velthos reported to the command ship. "These humans flee like prey animals, no organized resistance at all." What the aliens didn't understand was that Earth's military leaders had expected this outcome. The conventional forces were never meant to win the initial battle. They were meant to buy time for the real defenders to get into position. In jungles across South America, Special Forces teams were disappearing into the green maze. In the forests of Canada and Siberia, elite soldiers were becoming one with the wilderness. Mountain ranges in Asia and North America swallowed entire units of the world's most dangerous fighters. The Kethmori had conquered worlds of metal and crystal, planets where every surface was mapped and controlled. They had never faced an enemy that could vanish into living terrain that shifted and breathed and hid its secrets. Captain Yarthek led the first patrol into what had been the outskirts of São Paulo. His armor's sensors showed nothing but trees and undergrowth. The area appeared completely uninhabited, just more of the useless vegetation that covered this world. "Secure the perimeter and begin clearing operations," he commanded his squad. "Command wants this sector prepared for the construction crews." The Kethemori soldiers moved through the forest edge, their heavy armor crashing through underbrush. Their scanners could penetrate metal and stone easily, but the organic density of Earth's forests created a confusing maze of signals. Every tree, every bush, every patch of moss reflected energy in unpredictable ways. Maria Santos watched them through her scope from a position 30 meters away. The aliens moved like they were walking through an open field, never checking the canopy above or the shadows between the massive tree trunks. They clearly had no understanding of how to operate in this environment. She keyed her radio once, a brief signal that told her scattered team to prepare. Around the clearing, 8 other soldiers were invisible among the branches and undergrowth. Each one had been chosen for this mission because they could become part of the jungle itself. The Kethemori patrol stopped in a small clearing, their leader studying a holographic map projected from his gauntlet. They were trying to establish the coordinates for their base camp, completely unaware that they were standing in a carefully prepared killing ground. Maria's finger moved to her trigger. The jungle held its breath. The attack came from everywhere and nowhere. Suppressed rifle fire from concealed positions dropped 3 aliens before they could react. Explosive charges hidden in the undergrowth detonated, sending shrapnel through armor joints. A sniper's bullet found the gap in a helmet seal from impossible range. By the time the surviving Kethemori managed to return fire, their attackers had already melted back into the green shadows. Plasma bolts scorched trees and set patches of undergrowth ablaze, but hit nothing but vegetation. "Contact! Multiple hostiles!" Captain Yarthek shouted into his communicator, requesting immediate backup. But when the reinforcements arrived, they found only bodies and empty forest. The humans had vanished as completely as morning mist. The aliens' advanced sensors detected no movement, no heat signatures, no electromagnetic emissions. It was as if the jungle had swallowed their enemies whole. This scene repeated across the globe wherever alien forces tried to expand beyond the dead cities. In the Congo Basin, an entire Kethemori company disappeared overnight, leaving only scattered equipment and mysterious trails that led nowhere. In the forests of northern Canada, alien scouts reported contact with human forces, then went silent one by one. The Kethemori had expected to face armies in formation, battles they could win with superior firepower and technology. Instead, they found themselves fighting ghosts that struck without warning and disappeared without trace. Every patrol that entered the wilderness came back smaller, if it came back at all. Commander Zethkar studied the casualty reports with growing frustration. In 3 weeks of occupation, his forces had lost more soldiers than in the previous 5 campaigns combined. The humans weren't fighting like any enemy he'd encountered before. "They're primitives hiding in the undergrowth," he told his war council. "We'll burn out their hiding places. Orbital bombardment of all vegetation zones. But orbital bombardment of an entire planet's wilderness would take months, and every day brought new reports of missing patrols and sabotaged equipment. Supply convoys traveling between secured zones were ambushed by enemies that seemed to materialize from solid rock and empty air. The Kethemori Empire had conquered worlds, but they had never tried to hold a planet that fought back with its very landscape. Earth's wilderness was becoming their enemy, and they were losing ground they thought they'd already won. In a hidden cave system beneath the Amazon, human resistance leaders gathered around maps marked with red zones where alien forces had been eliminated. The plan was working better than anyone had dared hope. "They don't understand the terrain," reported Colonel Harrison, a weathered veteran of jungle conflicts. "They're trying to fight a conventional war in unconventional territory. Every advantage they have means nothing if they can't find us." The real war was just beginning. The aliens had won the cities, but the wilderness belonged to humanity. And in that wilderness, hunters who had learned to survive in Earth's most dangerous places were teaching the invaders a lesson about the difference between conquest and control. The jungle was patient, and it was hungry. The Kethmori Empire was about to discover what happened when apex predators tried to claim territory that already belonged to something deadlier. The hunt. 6 months after the initial invasion, the Kethmori Empire controlled less territory than when they first landed. Commander Zethkar paced his command center aboard the Void Piercer, watching red warning indicators spread across his tactical displays like a disease. "Explain this to me again," he demanded, pointing at a map showing their supposed secure zones. Half the markers were flashing with status unknown or contact lost. "Sir, we control the major landing sites and the ruins of the human cities," Captain Velthos replied carefully. "But every attempt to establish permanent bases in the vegetation zones has failed. The terrain is hostile." Hostile terrain was an understatement. The humans had turned their entire planet into a weapon. Every forest, every mountain range, every stretch of wilderness had become a maze of death for Kethmori forces. Supply lines were cut daily. Patrols disappeared without sending distress signals. Even heavily armored convoys were found days later as burning wreckage scattered across seemingly empty landscapes. Deep in the Siberian taiga, Captain Alexei Volkov crouched motionless in a snow-covered hide, watching an alien supply convoy approach through his thermal scope. The Kethmori had learned to travel only in heavily armed groups, but they still moved like they owned the territory. Alexei's team had been tracking this convoy for 2 days, waiting for the perfect ambush site. The aliens would have to slow down to navigate a narrow valley between 2 ridge lines. What they didn't know was that the entire valley had been prepared as a trap. "Ghost leader to all units," Alexei whispered into his throat microphone. "Target acquired. Execute on my mark." Explosives buried under the snow erupted in sequence, turning the convoy's path into a crater field. Anti-armor missiles streaked down from the ridgelines, punching through Kethmori vehicle armor. Sniper fire from concealed positions took down the survivors who tried to escape their burning transports. The attack lasted exactly 90 seconds. When the smoke cleared, nothing moved except the flames consuming alien equipment. The human soldiers were already disappearing into the forest, leaving behind no trace except the destruction they'd caused. This pattern repeated across every continent. In the Australian outback, Aboriginal trackers led special forces teams in attacks that seemed to come from the desert itself. In the Amazon, indigenous warriors moved through the canopy like shadows, teaching urban soldiers how to become part of the green maze. In the African savanna, local guides showed elite units how to use the landscape's natural rhythms to stay invisible. The Kethmori had expected to fight humans. Instead, they were fighting the planet itself. Sergeant Maria Santos had been in the jungle for 8 months, and she'd forgotten what it felt like to sleep indoors. Her team had become something that existed between civilization and wilderness, more dangerous than either. They lived off the land, moved without leaving tracks, and struck their enemies like natural disasters. "Movement on the eastern perimeter," whispered Corporal Jang, his voice barely audible through the comm system. "Full patrol, 20 contacts, heading for Grid 7. Maria smiled in the darkness. Grid 7 was another prepared kill zone, this one disguised as a natural clearing where the aliens might try to establish a temporary base. Hidden weapons caches, concealed observation posts, and carefully positioned explosive surprises waited for any enemy foolish enough to camp there. "Let them settle in," Maria replied. "Wait for them to get comfortable." The Kethmori patrol entered the clearing cautiously, their sensors sweeping for threats. Finding nothing but trees and undergrowth, they began setting up defensive positions. Their commander, a veteran of dozens of conquered worlds, felt confident in his security protocols. What he didn't understand was that the jungle had been watching him since he left his base that morning. Human eyes had tracked every step of his journey. Every decision he made had been anticipated and prepared for. The attack came at dawn, when the aliens were changing their guard rotation. Sniper fire from impossible ranges eliminated the sentries. Explosive charges turned their equipment into shrapnel. When the survivors tried to call for evacuation, they discovered their communications were being jammed by equipment they couldn't locate. By the time rescue forces arrived, they found only empty armor and scattered weapons. The humans had vanished so completely that thermal scans showed no trace of their presence. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed the patrol. Similar reports reached Kethmori Command from across the planet. In the Himalayas, an entire regiment had been cut off and destroyed by enemies who moved through mountain terrain like it was flat ground. In the Congo, alien forces reported being hunted by phantoms that struck from rivers, trees, and underground tunnels. "These humans are not fighting like a defeated species," observed Captain Velthos during a strategy meeting. "They're fighting like they're defending their hunting grounds." Commander Zethkar studied intelligence reports that made no sense according to Kethmori military doctrine. The humans weren't trying to retake their cities or rebuild their infrastructure. Instead, they were systematically destroying every attempt at expansion beyond the original landing zones. "They're using their planet's chaos against us," he realized with growing frustration. "Every natural feature is a potential ambush site. Every patch of vegetation could hide an army." The Kethmori military machine was designed for rapid conquest of organized civilizations. They could destroy cities, eliminate governments, and break the will of species that fought conventional wars. But they had never encountered an enemy that treated warfare as a form of hunting. Human special forces weren't just fighting in the wilderness. They had become part of it. They moved with the rhythms of the forests, the cycles of the seasons, the natural flows of the landscape. They struck like predators and disappeared like the wind. In the Rocky Mountains, Navy SEAL teams used ancient game trails to move unseen through terrain the aliens couldn't navigate. In the Amazon rainforest, Green Berets learned to travel through the canopy like the indigenous peoples who had lived there for thousands of years. In the Sahara Desert, elite units moved with Tuareg guides who could find water and shelter in places that looked lifeless to alien sensors. The Kethmori had conquered the obvious targets, but Earth's defenders had retreated to the places that couldn't be conquered with superior technology. The wilderness didn't care about advanced weapons or powered armor. It only cared about who understood its rules. "Status report," demanded Zethkar during the daily briefing. "We've lost contact with Base 7, Base 12, and the entire northern perimeter," Velthos replied reluctantly. "The convoy to Sector 5 was found destroyed this morning. No survivors." "How many is that this month?" 43 separate incidents, sir. We've lost nearly 2,000 soldiers to these phantom attacks." Zethkar's mandibles clicked in frustration. The Empire had never suffered such continuous losses while supposedly controlling a conquered world. Every day brought new reports of missing patrols, destroyed equipment, and supply lines that simply stopped functioning. The humans were bleeding the Kethmori occupation force slowly, steadily, without ever offering a target that could be decisively attacked. They fought like ghosts, like the wilderness itself come alive to drive out invaders. In hidden bunkers carved into mountainsides and disguised command posts deep in swamplands, human resistance leaders coordinated a war that had no front lines and no clear battles. They were fighting for time, bleeding the enemy while building strength for what was coming next. "The aliens are starting to pull back from extended positions," reported Colonel Harrison during an encrypted communication with resistance cells across 6 continents. "They're consolidating around their major bases." "Good. replied General Morrison from his cave complex beneath the Appalachian Mountains. Let them think they're being smart. The tighter they cluster, the better targets they make. The Keth-Mori Empire was learning a lesson that human armies had discovered throughout history. Controlling territory meant nothing if you couldn't hold it. And holding wilderness required understanding something the aliens had never learned. Earth wasn't just a planet to be conquered. It was a living system that had been shaping its defenders for millions of years. The humans weren't just fighting for their cities or their civilization. They were fighting as part of something larger, something that had been preparing for this war since the first human learned to track prey through a forest. The aliens had won the opening battles, but the real war was just beginning. In that war, the wilderness would choose its champions, and the Keth-Mori Empire was about to discover what happened when apex predators faced a planet that fought back. The Rising 1 year after invasion, Commander Zethkar stood before the High Council of the Keth-Mori Empire via holographic link, trying to explain how a primitive world was slowly destroying his occupation force. The gray-skinned counselors stared at him with expressions of growing disbelief. "You claim to control this planet," Counselor Vexthran stated coldly, "yet your own reports show diminishing territory and increasing casualties. Explain." "The humans fight unlike any species we've encountered," Zethkar replied carefully. "They use their world's chaotic landscape as a weapon. Every natural feature becomes a potential ambush site." "Primitive tactics," dismissed another counselor. "Increase bombardment operations. Eliminate the vegetation zones entirely." "We've tried, honored counselor. The vegetation covers 70% of the planet's surface. Orbital bombardment would take decades, and our ground forces continue to suffer losses during clearing operations." What Zethkar didn't mention was that the losses were accelerating. The humans weren't just hiding in their wilderness anymore. They were bringing the wilderness to the aliens. In the ruins of London, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell crouched in a storm drain beneath what had been Piccadilly Circus. Around her, 25 Special Forces operators prepared for the most audacious operation of the Resistance War. They were about to attack a fortified Keth-Mori base in the heart of occupied territory. "Remember," Sarah whispered into her throat mic, "we're not trying to hold ground. We hit fast, grab what we can, and disappear before their reinforcements arrive." The difference was that Sarah's team no longer looked like conventional soldiers. A year of living in the wild had changed them into something else. Their equipment was a mixture of salvaged alien technology, improvised weapons, and tools that belonged more in a survival situation than on a battlefield. They moved through the London Underground like water through cracks in stone. The Keth-Mori had mapped the obvious tunnels and sealed the major access points. But they'd never understood how the subway system connected to older networks of sewers, utility tunnels, and forgotten passages. The aliens controlled the surface, but underneath their feet lay a maze they couldn't see or predict. The humans had learned to use that maze like arteries in a living body, flowing unseen through the veins of their own cities. The attack began with explosives planted in the base's power distribution system. As the lights went out, human soldiers emerged from drain covers, maintenance hatches, and concealed positions that shouldn't have existed. They struck like wolves from the darkness, eliminated the guards, and vanished back into the underground before the Keth-Mori could organize a response. But this time, they took something with them: alien communication equipment, weapons, and most importantly, a data core containing tactical information about Keth-Mori positions across the continent. Similar raids were happening simultaneously across the globe. In occupied Beijing, resistance fighters emerged from ancient tunnel systems to strike at alien supply depots. In the ruins of Sydney, Aboriginal warriors led assault teams through song-line paths that existed in spiritual geography the Keth-Mori couldn't comprehend. The wilderness was coming to reclaim the cities. Deep in the Amazon basin, Maria Santos stood before a gathering that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Representatives from every major special forces unit on Earth surrounded her in a natural amphitheater carved by centuries of river flow. Green Berets sat beside Royal Marine Commandos. Navy SEALs shared intelligence with Russian Spetsnaz operators. SAS veterans planned operations with Japanese special forces. The wilderness had taught them to work together because survival depended on cooperation. National boundaries meant nothing when you were tracking alien patrol routes through unmarked forest. Military hierarchies dissolved when success required trusting your life to someone who could read the landscape like a book. Intelligence indicates the aliens are preparing for a major offensive, Maria reported. Studying data downloaded from captured Keth Mori systems. They're consolidating forces for what they call Final Pacification Protocol. Colonel Harrison, now sporting a beard that would have violated regulations in the old world, studied the alien tactical displays. They're going to try burning us out with concentrated orbital strikes. Let them try, replied Captain Yamamoto, whose Japanese Special Forces team had been operating in the Indonesian archipelago. They still don't understand what they're fighting. The truth was that the humans had evolved during their year in the wilderness. They weren't the same species the Keth Mori had invaded. Living on the edge of survival had awakened something primal, something that civilization had buried but never eliminated. They'd become apex predators adapted to a planet that was fighting alongside them. The Final Pacification Protocol began at dawn. Keth Mori warships in orbit commenced systematic bombardment of every forest, jungle, mountain range, and wilderness area on Earth. Plasma beams lanced down from space, turning vast stretches of vegetation into glowing craters. Commander Zethkar watched from his flagship as the planet's surface erupted in flames. This was how the Empire usually finished resistance movements. Eliminate their hiding places and force them into the open where superior technology could destroy them. But the bombardment revealed something unexpected. As the fires cleared and the smoke drifted away, thermal scans showed no mass casualties. The human resistance had somehow anticipated this attack and evacuated their positions before the strikes began. How did they know? Demanded Captain Velthos, studying the tactical readouts. The answer came 12 hours later when Keth Mori bases across 3 continents were attacked simultaneously by forces that emerged from underground. The humans hadn't just hidden in the wilderness. They'd learned to become part of it. When the surface was denied to them, they moved below ground. When the mountains were bombed, they flowed into the valleys. When the forests burned, they adapted to the ash fields. They fought like living geography, reshaping themselves to match whatever landscape remained available. In what had been Central Park in New York, Sergeant First Class Marcus Williams led his team through a maze of collapsed buildings and crater-scarred terrain toward the main Keth Mori command center. The park itself was gone, transformed into a hellscape of melted concrete and twisted metal. But Marcus had learned to navigate by different landmarks. He read the flow of wind through rubble, tracked the patterns of alien patrols by their electromagnetic signatures, and moved through devastation like it was just another type of terrain to master. His team followed him because he'd kept them alive for a year by understanding what others couldn't see. The Keth Mori had built their command center where the United Nations building used to stand, surrounded by defensive positions and early warning systems. It should have been impregnable to ground assault by primitive human forces. But Marcus wasn't thinking like a soldier attacking a fortress. He was thinking like a predator, stalking prey that had wandered into his hunting ground. The assault came from directions the aliens hadn't considered possible. Underground explosives destabilized the foundation. Sniper fire from impossible ranges eliminated sentries. Small teams infiltrated through gaps in the defensive grid that shouldn't have existed. By the time the Keth Mori command staff realized they were under attack, human forces were already inside their perimeter, moving through their defenses like water through a broken dam. The aliens had superior weapons and armor, but they were fighting an enemy that had learned to make every piece of cover, every shadow, every structural weakness into an ally. The battle raged for 6 hours before the command center fell. When the smoke cleared, the most fortified position in North America was in human hands, and the Kethmori Eastern Command structure had been completely eliminated. Similar victories occurred around the globe as the final pacification protocol backfired catastrophically. Instead of breaking the human resistance, the orbital bombardment had forced them to adapt once again. They emerged from their hiding places more dangerous than ever, carrying weapons they'd learned to make from salvaged alien technology and moving with skills that a year of wilderness survival had burned into their bones. Commander Zethkar received the reports with growing horror. In 72 hours, his occupation force had lost more ground than in the previous 6 months. The humans weren't just surviving his attacks, they were using his own tactics against him. "Immediate evacuation of all forward positions," he ordered. "Fall back to primary landing zones and prepare for defensive operations." But the humans didn't give him time to consolidate. They pressed their advantage like wolves pursuing wounded prey, striking at retreating columns and isolated garrisons. The Kethmori Empire discovered what every invader throughout Earth's history had learned. Retreat from an enemy that controlled the terrain was more dangerous than advance. The wilderness had taught humanity to hunt as a pack. Now that pack had its prey on the run, and they knew how to finish what they'd started. In bunkers and caves around the world, resistance leaders coordinated the final phase of their campaign. They'd learned the alien communication codes, mapped their supply lines, and identified every weakness in their defensive positions. Most importantly, they'd learned to work together as a single organism spread across an entire planet. "All units, this is command," General Morrison broadcast on the encrypted network that now linked every human fighting force on Earth. "The enemy is retreating. Do not let them reach their ships." The planet itself seemed to rise up in response. From every forest, every mountain, every stretch of wilderness that had been bombed and burned and scarred, human warriors emerged to reclaim their world. They moved with the confidence of apex predators returning to territory that had always belonged to them. The Kethmori Empire had mocked Earth's wilderness, dismissing it as primitive chaos that could be easily controlled. Now that wilderness was teaching them the difference between conquest and survival. And on this world, only one species had learned to make the wilderness an ally. The war wasn't over yet, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The hunters had become the hunted, and the jungle was closing in.